This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by LRN.FM. Feds don't want you to hear them.
Let's see how well I can do when I just spew. So, as you may have noticed, I'm kind of into making predictions, but I probably would be pretty good at it if I actually did some research, right? I just make predictions kind of off the top of my head because, time constraints. I don't want to pour my life into research. I want to pour it into the audio recorder and into the camera. But I have been studying a lot about how predictions work. What kind of person and what kind of practice leads to the best prediction? And of course, research and a lot of hard work is a big part of it. And I'm not hitting on that cylinder. So my success rate's going to be a lot lower than it would have been if I'd done that. But I'm getting a lot of other things right. And because I could always add research into the process if I wanted to, if I thought I was getting paid enough to justify it, or there was some other reason. But what seems to work, apparently, is if you have a small group of people, they each need to be a little different from each other, open-minded, voracious readers or listeners, willing to change their position, constantly actually incrementing their position. They call these super forecasting groups. Google Phil Tetlock and Warren Hatch. Tetlock is the one who discovered what works, and Warren Hatch is the one who created the first super forecasting group. Actually, I should say Tetlock was just more interested in finding out what worked, and Warren Hatch kind of delivered that on a platter to him. Interestingly, this was funded by the government, and the government is now basically ignoring the recommendations of the super forecasting groups, and it's private companies that are taking advantage of it. So it's sort of like the internet process. It's kind of the same as what happened with the internet, except faster. So one prediction I would make is that you will see this really becoming a thing, super forecasting groups. And unlike now, where a lot of what these groups are doing isn't really like goodjudgment.com, I don't think they're publishing a lot of their predictions. You can go in there and make predictions, but I think that what you'll see is a lot of this is mainstreamed, and you start getting, it becomes trendy to have your own super forecasting group, or to keep up with the latest forecasts. There'll be apps. There's already a web forum, I think, on Good Judgment, or Good Judgment Open maybe, where you can go and participate. And I think you can read a lot of forecasts, but it's kind of hard to tell whose group am I reading here. Like, am I reading a group forecast that has a group with a good track record, or is this just some new bunch of people testing the thing out? I don't know. But at any rate, I still agree with Lark and Rose that it's good to make predictions of your own, even if you're just making them off the top of your head like me. Get them on video, and then later you can go back and other people can go back. And if it just so happens you're one of the people who's any good at it, then you'll be able to see that later, and the public will also be able to see that. So since you don't have a lot of groups that you can, or a lot of, proven groups that you can rely on for predictions, today you're stuck with me. They're out there, they're reliable, but I just don't think that a lot of their stuff, it's just not getting publicly published, and not in a timely manner. Not that I could find last time I looked. Let me know and post in the comment sections if you know otherwise. So I want to make some more predictions, again, off the cuff, about what I think probably will and won't happen as this war shapes up, probably between the United States and China. One thing I think they will do, and I think they'll do it soon, probably are already doing it, and we just don't know for sure. They'll do what the East German Stasi did in the 70s and 80s era, and they will fund United States terrorist groups that commit acts of terrorism inside the United States, or acts of guerrilla warfare. The two are not the same. But of course, the U.S. government will pretend that they are the same, much like much like they executed that U.S. soldier who killed some other U.S. soldiers for political reasons. It was a guerrilla attack, but they treated him like he was a terrorist. He was, in fact, more like Michael Collins or Subcomandante Marcos. Open to question morally, but not necessarily a terrorist. And in any other Western country, they would not have killed him, or at least they would not have executed him. Oh, and I'm talking about the Fort Hood killings, which was really, actually, they call it the Fort Hood massacre, and they're not lying about that. It was sort of a massacre because of the fact that they disarmed their own soldiers. Those brilliant feds. Anyway, so yeah, I think it would be sort of a Baader-Meinhof scenario where you see, like, you know, nowadays you don't get much domestic terrorism in the United States, even over the last few months. That really hasn't been a thing. I think you'll see it. You know, probably. I guess they would take some existing organization and just add money to it to fuel the fire. The Chi-Coms will. And this is pretty effective in West Germany when the East Germans did it to the West Germans. And you saw, it was interesting how as soon as the East German government went away, the terrorism in West Germany went away, right? Pretty much. So I'm sure there are secret meetings happening, maybe in the U.S. between Chinese officials and Trump haters or other people. You know, most Trump haters are, you know, they're like me. They don't like Trump, but they're not going to hurt anybody over it. But the Chi-Coms will find someone who can actually wants to blow things up, and you know, it'll unfold in just as brutal and indiscriminate a manner as you would expect, probably. My respect for the Chi-Coms will go up if that's not how it unfolds. You know, if this is targeted stuff, I will be surprised, and I will recognize the lesser evil of guerrilla warfare when I see it, and I will raise concerns if it gets referred to as terrorism inaccurately. At least that's the plan. And I guess if I were the Chi-Coms and I were evil and I just wanted to spread chaos in the United States, I'd be funding Muslim terrorism too, because, you know, they know how that really gets the Americans goat. Although you never know, there might be, sorry to hedge here, but it may be that since that tends to unify Americans, they may want to avoid that and focus on, you know, internal dissent type terrorism. They may decide to, I should say. You will probably see inappropriate retaliation in the form of Americans, nationalistic Americans attacking Chinese businesses or restaurants. My God. Think of how many targets they're going to have. It's going to be awful. I hope I'm wrong. Of course, you will see many more Americans coming to the defense and support of their Chinese brothers and sisters who live here. Not necessarily Chinese anymore if they live here, right? They're Americans. Chinese Americans. So I'm kind of basing that on U.S. history in World War I, where that sort of happened with German businesses. The English did that too to German businesses in World War I. You know, I don't think it happened that much in World War II in terms of the way the Germans were treated. Japanese, of course, were rounded up into concentration camps. I've never heard a lot of stories of Japanese businesses being attacked in World War II, but it probably did happen. So I think the Chinese power grab will try to play out kind of the same way that the Serbian power grab played out in the late 1980s, where it was It was about going after Kosovo and reestablishing Belgrade and Serbian control over Kosovo, so that basically, as Milosevic used to put it, Serbia would now control all of its territory instead of having this sort of special zone of Kosovo. Well, a lot of that is similar to what's going on in Hong Kong. And, you know, I don't sense the same degree of Munich type mentality of let's just give in and give them everything they want and bend over. And that's kind of how Croatia and Bosnia reacted to the Serbian consolidation of Kosovo in the 80s. But I don't really sense that happening with the world in relation to Hong Kong. It seems like the reaction is pretty stalwart against it. Of course, I didn't even know this was going on in Kosovo in the 80s, right? It was such a small sideshow thing. World wasn't paying much attention, so the Croatians and Slovenians just didn't have a lot behind them, right? With the case of Hong Kong, you've got the whole world kind of upset about it. On the other hand, the people who are taking over Hong Kong have 1.4 billion people under their control. So that's a heck of a lot bigger than what Serbia had under its control back in the day. But I suspect the Chinese just they are successful in Hong Kong initially, and they do subvert it and subdue it. And then the conflict moves to China, moves to Taiwan or the South China Sea. And of course, it's borderless. It occurs in cyberspace with attacks on primarily U.S. AI institutes of various sorts. Any institute that's making good progress on AI that might beat the Chinese to it. And by that, I mean AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. The United States, of course, will react and continue to react with continuing trade embargoes and sanctions until trade just basically shuts down between the United States and China, I expect. Ambassadors will get sent home. First, it will just be, you know, minor embassy staff or people who have been accused of something, some spying or whatnot. Again, this is what I think will probably happen. I'm not saying I'm sure any of it will happen. It's just the least unlikely scenarios that I can think of. China begins to descend back into the, and I mean economically, descend back into the Maoist type of era that it lived in when people had barely enough to eat. But I would guess it'll probably go only about halfway to that point, right? It won't. I don't think it'll ever, in the absence of a major kinetic war stretching inside to China, deep inside China, I don't think it's going to ever actually look like that, right? It'll still kind of look modern. The infrastructure will mostly continue to function. But again, you know, I am predicting a war, so maybe we get missiles flying between the two countries deep inside each other's territory. Since there's never been an actual nuclear war between two nuclear-armed powers, I would not predict that there will be one now. I think somehow that will be avoided. It has been avoided in the past. But the China victory scenario that is possible, I don't predict it necessarily, but the way it would look is maybe around the year 2031 you are sitting in the bathtub and suddenly you have an aneurysm and you're done. Out of the blue, nothing else much going on. And that happens to millions of people around the United States in an instant because they've developed some sort of nanotech or some sort of AI, AGI that focuses on the very small. They say nanotech will come before AGI. AGI is predicted to, come into existence in the 2030s, I guess. Well, it's complicated. Ray Kurzweil predicts 2045, but he also predicts there will be a computer smarter than a human by 2030. So, a computer smarter than a human, wouldn't that be able to devise a way of delivering an attack like this? You'd think so. I guess the Chi-Coms would go after, they would try to decapitate the country. They'd go after all the people who are influencers, political activists, that they're obviously anti-authoritarian, the government itself. That's kind of what defeat would probably look like for us. And of course, it might not play out from the Chinese. The federal government might do that to us, or some other great power might do it, or some other small power even. And you might be lucky if you're killed, right? They might do something else to you. They might, the devices might be able to make you into a slave, or they might be able to permanently incapacitate you along the lines of the Ralph Peters scenario called The War in 2020. He wrote that in 1990. I guess the priority target of any foreign power in an attack like that would be U.S. personnel responsible for any weapons of mass destruction. So they would try to take out the people running nuclear, weapons first, and nanoweapons, and any bioweapons. They would just try to kill them all during the same 5-minute period of time, eliminating our ability to strike back. And of course, I shouldn't use the word our. It's their ability, the federal ability. They're not me, and I'm not them. But the Chi-Coms and terrorist groups don't know that. They don't think like that. And that's the main flaw in human thinking, is the collective thinking, right? You're a Kosovar rather than an individual. You're a Serbian rather than an individual. You're a Chinese rather than an individual. And, they just think of me as an American, as part of this evil process, even though I'm not. So, I am forced into considering conflict with these indiscriminate people, these Chi-Coms, who are even worse about their indiscrimination than most, and which control 1.4 billion people, all of whom we should think of as innocent individuals until proven guilty. But, more predictions, that's not how the feds will wage their war. They haven't been targeted in Afghanistan. They've killed 8 civilians for every terrorist. Well, actually, they've done even worse than that if you consider the fact that most of the so-called terrorists they kill aren't even terrorists. They're just guerrilla fighters. So, and that's with modern weapons and targeted munitions. They can land a missile within 3 meters of where they aim it reliably, and yet they have this incredibly bad kill ratio. It was probably worse in the previous wars. And I guess it will get worse again if things start really getting messy, right? U.S. fighting in Afghanistan is pretty controlled. They have their fully functioning command bunkers and places where they, organize and plan their attacks, and they have the white chess piece. They don't have, it's not like their own infrastructure has been damaged very much, ever. Once things start getting sloppy, because of an actual enemy that's really powerful, like China, and things start breaking down or getting damaged on the American side, that's going to go out the window. The targeted stuff, it's not going to work right anymore. And so you would see this reversion to, again, if this turns to a kinetic war, you'd see this reversion pretty quickly to indiscriminate killing. To Baghdad versus Tehran Scud attacks that can only aim well enough to hit a city, right? Or Dresden, where you can firebomb the whole city, but you can't seem to find the oil depot you were targeting last week because there's never a clear line of sight to it in the awful weather above Peenemünde. Actually, that's not a very good example. If they were going to hit Peenemünde, they would have done that with a low level attack. Anyway, I'm wrong again. I think they used both kinds of attacks. Anyway, it was too close to the Allies. It was so close to the Allies that you had lots of options. Anyway, there was one U.S. pilot who said that I think he completed all 25 of his missions in a a high altitude B-24 or 25, I forget which. And he said he never actually saw his target. So attacking from a high altitude deep into Germany, you just wouldn't. The weather would just be too. It would not be clear enough, generally, for any kind of precision. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. I had meant to predict. I was certainly predicting it in my own actions, but I never actually said it on the air, and I should have. But I had meant to predict, that there will be like a follow-up, some sort of follow-up virus, some new, maybe a secret bio attack or something like that. And I think that's going to happen. I've been kind of expecting that, regardless of whether we have a full-blown kinetic war or whatnot. But of course, before I got around to saying that into the audio recorder, I guess it looks like it's sort of already happened, as it seems like they have these new outbreaks in China. And speaking of outbreaks in China, we should all be mindful of that. What is that Sun Tzu quote? Feigned disorder postulates perfect order. I should look it up here. Okay, here it is. Quote, simulated disorder postulates perfect discipline. Simulated fear postulates courage. Simulated weakness postulates strength. Unquote. So whatever else the Chinese leadership gets wrong, they probably do at least listen to some things Sun Tzu says, since he's their, ancestor in a sense. He was actually a very humane guy for his time. He's probably a more humane guy than most of the military operatives of our time. But the Chi-Coms probably listened to him, just on the how do we achieve victory basis. And, you wonder sometimes if they attack themselves to feign disorder, right? And make sure that they weren't blamed for it. Maybe they believed, and they certainly claim, that their system and society is better capable of handling these kinds of things than ours is. So, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they use the COVID-19 on themselves. By the way, ndt-tv calls it the CCP virus, the Chinese Communist Party virus. New Tang Dynasty TV. They're worth watching. But yeah, I wouldn't. I mean, it certainly does look like an awful large amount of simulated disorder, if it is in fact simulated. More than you would expect one to inflict on themselves if they were doing it on purpose. But, of course, it may have gotten a little out of control, and they may have done it to themselves, but then not intended for it to hurt them as much as it did. If it's got me focused on China and raring to get into the information war against them, against their government, not them, then it must have created a lot of anger around the world, because I'm not one to normally focus on foreign threats to Americans when the federal government is such a massive threat to them. And it's important to keep some things in perspective, I mean, the federal government does spend a great deal more on military than the Chinese government does. I don't remember how big the disparity is. The Americans spend, I think, 7 times as much money on military as Russia does, which I always thought was a good reason to not go paranoid about the Russian government. But, again, you never know what they can do, for sure, and they seem to have done some fairly effective stuff along the lines of Mustafa Kemal, when he was reconquering Turkey. They've done it in a much slower manner. I'm talking about Ataturk, the leader of Turkey in the 1920 era, and the successful, limited, but sometimes brutal Turkish pushback against their loss in World War I and possible British domination. Allied domination, maybe I should say. Anyway, the Russians are kind of like that. It's not the end of civilization, but again, the Russian government is like that. The Chinese government, I don't think they're like that. I think they're more like Stalin or Hitler, and we just don't know if maybe they really did do this to us on purpose. And if you look at the way it's playing out, the U.S., I guess they have, I read somewhere the U.S. has 25% of the deaths, but only, it's a much smaller percentage of the world's population, I forget. So, the concept is pretty plausible. A false flag attack, that's really a thing. I mean, it's not beyond, we know that, I don't know if it's, false flag attack might not be the right word, but the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993 was, in fact, partially generated by the federal government. I don't think that's really in dispute. It's just that it was probably accidental, right? They were tied in with this Muslim group that did it, but I don't know that they really meant for them to do it. Right? It was probably one of those attempts at, that sort of FBI foils FBI terror plot type scenario when they weren't really intending for any bombs to go off, but they were involved. And is it beyond plausibility to think that the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995 was done by the Clintons? Yeah, I think that's pretty plausible. They certainly were the beneficiaries. 2001 attack, was that done by the feds? Maybe. It's possible. I don't know. I'm not a truther, but again, they were the big beneficiaries. They had a motive. Hermann Goering probably was the one who burned down the Reichstag. That was a false flag attack. There was a false flag attack on a German radio station right before World War II officially broke out in September 1939. The Germans attacked one of their own facilities. False flags are a thing. It's possible this is the mother of all false flags perpetrated by the Chinese government in a manner designed to make it so that it wouldn't be held responsible. Because, if they did something that had a good chance of being outed, right, like an attack on New York with biological weapons or something, I think they kind of know that could result in some nuclear weapons being exchanged, so they wouldn't want to do it that way. So it's appropriate to be agnostic about all these questions until there's overwhelming evidence. Like Jim Rickards says, who's pretty good at making predictions, just start with 50-50 and go from there if you don't know anything. I guess I'm still I'm pretty close to 50-50 on the Oklahoma City bombing. And I don't know if it was the Clintons necessarily that did it, but it certainly could have been the feds. I think 50% chance it was some element of the federal government that did it. Again, look how much they benefited from it. The 01 attack, I think I'm more 30-70. I think it's only about a 30% chance the feds did it, or some element of the federal government. Just because it's been looked at so closely for so many years. I think we would have seen more evidence by now that the feds did it if they did it. And of course, it doesn't have to be the feds in any official capacity. It could be some very small group operating inside the federal government, or it could be part of some shadow government or the deep state or whatnot. Is it possible that 8 people could have done it? Maybe. Maybe the number could have been super small. At least done part of it. The ground side part of it. But the... we do have evidence from the FBI. To their credit, the FBI has accused, and this is 10 years ago, I think, the FBI accused a federal worker of committing the 9/20 attacks in 2001, which, if you have forgotten, were the biological attacks by a federal biolab worker, against various federal targets. It was his way of trying to increase funding, I guess, for his favorite program. by scaring everybody. So that was an inside job that the federal government announced was an inside job. Well, hardly anyone ever talks about that. I bet you didn't even know that. All right, can't think of anything to add. More later. Check back in 10 years, see if I got any of this right. if we're around to witness it. Okay, bye.
I don't like freedom radio talk. Listening to LRN FM makes me balk. Far from it, I should probably walk. LRN.FM. Feds don't want you to hear them.